When it comes to doing support, you've got to find effective ways to communicate. And to tell us more about that at the help desk level, we've brought in Juan Fernandez. Juan, how you doing?
I'm doing great, James. Thanks for having me.
You've been a great communicator for many years. Tell us about your history, and let's start talking about good communication techniques.
Like many, I started off at the help desk. So I started off in one of the roughest patches, and I moved myself up through tier one, tier two, tier three, tier four, supervisor, manager, leader, business owner. Again, now fourth time CEO. So I've been there, and definitely communication is key.
When it comes to communication, we as I'm just going to call us all geeks because that's what I love. I love the tech.
We are.
We have our tech, we have our lingo about the tech, right? But a lot of the people that we support, they don't share the same lingo. They just need something, right? So let's talk about what it means to communicate effectively outside of the tech world.
I think we get caught up in a lot of conversation around the tech. We get really excited about something we know a lot about, and we want to tell everyone about it, right? So like whether it be a firewall, understanding the ACLs and all of the, firewall roles and all of the stuff that we can do with Radius and everything that we can do with everything else. I just said three acronyms, which we all probably know, but I can tell you that most layman people don't have any idea what that is. So it's always been a challenge, right? To have meaningful conversation with people that don't know exactly what we're talking about. I for the longest time, my parents said that they thought I fixed computers for the last 20 some years, and it was fun for them to assume that, but it was just hard for them to conceive that I did something different. Right. And I think that it's hard for our, the people that we're talking to on the other side. We shouldn't have any understanding or thought that they know what we're talking about. We talk, you and I, James, could have very technical conversations, but we have to be very sensitive to the fact that we have to think in a very different way when we're having customer conversations.
Because there are a lot of times when you're going to expect the customer or ask the customer to do a certain thing. One time, I remember somebody was saying, "Hey, we need to reset the VPN," and the customer was just, reset what? They didn't even know they weren't VPN, right?
Yeah.
Like that, or well, it seems to be an issue with the FAT32, and the person, kind of heard, 32 pounds overweight. What do you mean? And stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's the same way, right? Even with communications now, you're like, oh, well, your VoIP phone isn't functioning. And they're like, my what phone? And they're like, oh, your soft phone, sorry. Right. And they're like, soft phone? I have a hard phone. Right. So it's just knowing the nomenclature that's appropriate for the individual and the person that you're speaking to.
Yeah, it's 2FA. They don't know what two-factor authentication is. Let's say you don't want to get into that conversation. You got to figure out the communication, the language from the customer's perspective that will get the job finished, right? That will close the ticket, as it were, or will solve that person's problem, right?
I agree.
When it comes to things, various sensitivities out there, there's cultural sensitivity, and you could talk about business culture, for example, or whatever, but different cultures, as we live in an increasingly globalized world. What are some of the insights you have about that?
I think that the big thing about the cultural sensitivity is that, a lot of people that are calling into help desks, many large organizations are using centralized help desks that are distributed across the world. And through this last couple of years and even beyond, it's become more commonplace. And we have to be very cognizant of having conversations with, not only with, people in the US, but outside of the US, because things that we say inside of the US mean totally different things outside the US. I often hear funny words being said, and I'm like, well, that doesn't mean the same thing where I come from, right? And it's just really interesting because we don't really think that way. It's the same thing in the tech community, right? Sometimes we think everyone knows what a firewall does, where if you're talking to somebody in the construction industry, they're thinking about, very thick, fibrous cement board, right? And so it's one of those things where you see the different nomenclatures play out, and we have to be very cognizant of being forethought in regards to who we're having conversations with.
When it comes to dealing with customers where you have a customer that's gotten upset simply because they've got a deadline and their tech isn't working for them. What are some of the ways that you can best put people at ease, not argue with them, and basically put everybody in a position to solve the problem?
I think, you have to be very upfront about what the problem is and explaining it simply, setting proper expectations, communicating clearly and effectively, and then making sure that you're educating the end user on the situation, right? I think we forget that oftentimes where, it's like, okay, it's fixed and we move on. But we forgot to explain the situation around it to make them feel good about the fact, and then maybe potentially educate them so that they don't recreate the issue if it was their fault, right? Not saying that it was, but we definitely need to make sure that we're following through the effective process of enabling the end user to be successful moving forward.
Juan, thanks so much for your insights, talking about the importance of communicating well at the help desk.
Thanks so much for having me, James.